All
Hey
set.
everybody, welcome to the Let Freedom Ring podcast, another episode brought to you from Missoula, Montana at the state GOP convention. I'm joined with a very special guest today, Congressman Matt Rosendale, who I've had the privilege of knowing for over 5 years now. Matt, how you doing today?
Great. It's good to be with you, Jesse.
Yeah, it's really good to have you here. So you've been representing Montana now, well, Montana at large for your first term, and now you just got reelected in a landslide to your second term. So how's it been going over there? What's your message to Montanans about what it's like in D.C.?
Well, having the majority here in the second Congress has given us the ability to be a little bit more productive. Obviously, we have the committee chairs. We get to set the agenda. We get to control more who our witnesses are when they come into the different hearings. And we actually get hearings on our legislation. The first Congress, I was used to participating in the state legislature, where every bill that we introduced actually was granted a hearing. And that's not how Congress works. If you're in the minority party, your legislation that you introduce, unless it's pretty vanilla, which is legislation that I wouldn't be supporting anyway, you're not even granted a hearing. If it's something that's substantive, if it's something that's bold, that's going to make a difference, the majority typically isn't going to give you that opportunity. So having the control over those committees, being able to have hearings on the legislation that I've introduced makes it, you just feel like you're being a lot more productive.
Absolutely. And so one thing that you've been involved in, even long before your time in Congress, has been healthcare. Yeah. And healthcare costs, among everything else, are skyrocketing right now. And it seems like everybody's healthcare plan is determined from some giant bureaucracy. It's determined from some bureaucrat, from some regulation, from any number of things. So kind of tell us a little bit about your thoughts on direct-to-primary care. I know that was something that you really worked hard on when you were the state auditor.
I did. So as the Commissioner of Securities and Insurance for the state of Montana, from 2016 to 2020, I made healthcare delivery, access to quality, affordable healthcare, a main tenet of my work while I was there. And what I continue to say is that we will never begin to bend the cost curve for healthcare down if we don't connect the consumer to the actual dollars that are being spent. If you have them isolated from what the cost of healthcare actually is through the different hidden means of a provider and an insurance company, and they are disconnected from that, then you're going to continue to see costs spiral out of control. So I focused early on in my administration on trying to make sure that we could offer a vast array of different ways for people to address their healthcare needs and ways that accommodated their needs, their budgets, and their personal preferences, whether it was religious beliefs, principles, whatever, that it was accommodated in the way that they wanted. And by doing so, we opened up a lot of alternatives that people hadn't really been looking at previously. And so by doing that, we were able to actually reduce the rates on the individual market, which was the most volatile of all the markets in insurance for healthcare, by 15%. At the very first year that we implemented a lot of those practices, I was able to get legislation passed that recognized direct primary care physicians and agreements as not being an insurance product. And when we did that, we immediately saw that business model expand dramatically across the state of Montana. So we went from having 0 direct primary care physicians to, I think there's about a dozen of them right now. And what that does is gives the physician the ability to charge a flat rate, somewhere in the neighborhood. I've seen anything from about $85 a month to $100 a month for a vast array of services, many times including lab work. And then the consumer knows that they can get all of those services taken care of, whether they go in once a month, once a day, once a year, for that flat cost. Now, I make it very clear to people, and so do those physicians in their agreements. That doesn't cover you if you have appendicitis or break your leg. Yeah. You're going to need a hospitalization plan, but it puts people in the position to buy a truly high deductible hospitalization plan and know that they've got their day-to-day cough, sniffle, flu, strep throat taken care of. And for folks especially that have chronic diseases like high blood pressure or diabetes, these plans are incredibly good. And it's driving down the cost of healthcare to the families by tens of thousands of dollars a year.
Absolutely. And these plans, they're much more of something like a personal option where it puts the patient and the doctors back in the driver's seat. I mean, the kind of what you've outlined, it's just there's so much that patients have to fight against right now with these regulations, these top-down plans that the government thinks that they know best what kind of healthcare you need.
And it limits the way with which they can address their healthcare. The other thing that I've been trying to get passed at the federal level is an expansion, a dramatic expansion of the healthcare savings plans. Okay. And by doing so, I personally think that people should be allowed to put as much into a healthcare savings account as they want to. I really do believe that, as long as when the dollars come out, that they use them for either procedures, premiums, or pharmaceuticals. And if you want to use it for a premium for a healthcare plan, great. If you're going to use it for procedures for a healthcare plan, great. Pharmaceuticals. So if you decide, Jesse, that you would like to go to a chiropractor, and you should be able to draw money out of your healthcare savings plan to use that. If I don't choose to go to a chiropractor, but I'd like to use an acupuncturist or some other, direct primary care physician, I should be able to do that. And those dollars should not be limited on what we can put into those accounts. And again, when you give the consumer the control of those dollars and they can start placing them where they see value, that is how the marketplace works.
I think you just hit on the most important point of this, that when it's not just some giant plan that nobody sees how much something costs, when it's actually a high deductible plan that covers a catastrophic illness, something like that, then the consumers have their dollars, they have the control of those, and then the market gets to take effect. They start to realize, hey, maybe I don't need to pay $150 for an aspirin or any number of outrageous things that we've seen from these kind of top-down government plans.
Well, what we saw from these top-down government plans is people had a deductible, and once they met their deductible, they really weren't aware of how much their health care costs for any procedure whatsoever. And the reason they weren't aware is because they didn't care. Once they met their deductible, it was no longer money out of their pocket. And this is where we saw this terrible spiraling of healthcare costs going out of control. And then when you saw the prescription drug component get added in, it just multiplied it and exacerbated it even worse. And that's why we see the prescription drug component of healthcare driving a lot of that healthcare cost even worse yet. And then that's a discussion that we could spend about an hour on what is driving that. But I can tell you, it's not just from the manufacturers. The manufacturers or the people that are producing the drugs. There's a lot of steps in between before you get to the consumer's mouth that is driving those costs up.
Absolutely. And I mean, this all kind of goes back. I remember my mom telling me this, my grandma telling me, like back when they were growing up, they never charged insurance when they went to the doctor's office. They never gave an insurance card to go get a checkup or anything like that. It's kind of like if you had car insurance and you're trying to put gas on your car insurance, it's going to drive up the cost of your car insurance astronomically. And so that seems what's been happening with our healthcare plan. And kind of along those lines, what's HR 977? I know that you have been instrumental in that bill.
Okay, so that's another one of these provisions that we're trying to make sure that you can open the marketplace up. And what that would do is allow physicians to actually own medical facilities and still be able to make referrals to themselves within their facilities and receive Medicare consumers. There's a big problem right now across the country that most facilities only accept a certain amount of Medicare recipients because Medicare pays at a lower rate. And so they're only going to take a certain percentage of those recipients as part of their practice. But if you allow more physicians to have ownership of facilities and make referrals into those facilities, then you're going to be able to accommodate more of those consumers, where right now that they aren't. So what it does is it creates a larger demand for physicians for the Medicare population, that there's not enough physicians out there to accommodate their needs.
Absolutely. And we actually were working on a bill right now in the state legislature that got passed for physician assistants, where now in Montana, physician assistants are allowed to open their own independent practice without the supervision of a doctor specifically, to kind of increase that supply like you're talking about.
Everyone should be able to practice their trade or their profession to the full extent of what their licensing and recognition is.
Absolutely. And kind of shifting gears a little bit into another huge topic for Montanans is energy. So not only are energy costs skyrocketing, I mean, gasoline, electricity, any number of things, but in particular in Montana, we've got a wealth of natural resources that we are prohibited from utilizing right now, from unleashing. And for the first 2 years in the Biden administration, you've just seen nothing but top-down regulations, red tape that are driving up energy costs. So kind of what's your message to Senator Tester and to President Biden right now?
Yeah, look, Senator Tester and the rest of the Democrat Party have made a decision that whether the American people like it or not, they're going to try to force them onto renewable energy sources. And the problem is that this country is not set up to sustain that. We just aren't. Wind energy, there's a farm that is just north of Miles City. It's one of the most efficient in the country, can run at 42% of the time at full capacity. Quick math tells you that means 58% of the time they aren't. And when we start losing base load electricity production, it is dangerous for our country because there's a lot of people that are subject to having blackouts. It compromises our national security because we can be at a time when we have low energy capacity or availability. And the other thing that it does that a lot of people miss the boat on is it drives down our manufacturing capability dramatically. When those energy costs go up, one of the biggest expenses that are associated with manufacturing or energy consumption. And very expensive energy means that you're not going to be able to continue to attract manufacturing, which is what we need in this country. Again, that goes back to not only expanding our economy, but also making sure that our national security is intact because we have to have manufacturing. That's how we won World War II. Yep. It's because we could create more tanks, more guns, more ships, more airplanes to fight the Axis, okay, than the evil Axis than any other country on earth. And we've lost a lot of that manufacturing capability through a multitude of reasons. So as a result of that, what we did is when this Congress was sworn in, we passed H.R. 1. H.R. 1 was a compilation of several energy bills, one of mine, to make sure that we increase and mandate the sale leases on public lands that do have oil and gas reserves on them, to make sure that the government is holding those leases every quarter the way that they are supposed to. And if they miss a quarter, that they follow it up as soon as physically possible with another sale. But in addition to that, there's a lot of provisions in there to make sure that we streamline the NEPA process for pipeline permits, for export facility permits for natural gas so that we can actually sell some of this energy to our allies overseas, and they're not dependent on tyrants either, and to streamline the process for mining permits for critical minerals because we have become so dependent on China there as well. And by doing that and increasing our energy production, it's going to help, again, not just our economy, but our national security as well, and help us reduce inflation because the cost of energy is one of the biggest drivers of inflation that we have.
Absolutely. Do you want to expand a little bit more about maybe how just unleashing American abundance, energy abundance right now can help with the overall rising prices that Americans are feeling? And also have us produce the energy right here, because it's not like the energy isn't being produced. It's being produced right now overseas from unreliable sources, any number of factors with national security. So do you want to just touch on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, first I will tell you that the folks that are so concerned about the environment, if they were being truthful with themselves, they would recognize that actually the environment suffers more when energy is not being produced here in the United States, because the environmental standards that we have and the labor standards that we have are so much greater than any other place on earth that the environment is actually compromised. And they have demonstrated that under the Biden administration that emissions have increased globally because we're using energy from other sources. It's not as clean, and the methods with which they extract that energy are not as environmentally sound as the way that we do it. The Biden administration has decreased the crude oil production domestically in the neighborhood. It fluctuates, regularly, but in the neighborhood of 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day. This is what has got energy prices going up. And now we just saw the Saudis come out and announce 2 days ago that they're going to reduce OPEC output output by 1 million barrels a day. Crude oil is a global product, and it is based on global prices, and it is all about supply and demand. And so if we can get back, we have the resources here, we have the know-how here, but they have made it so incredibly difficult to produce our offshore resources in the Gulf, and they've made it so incredibly difficult to produce our onshore resources here on public lands around the country that is squished, okay, or decrease that domestic production dramatically. And that's where we see energy costs going up. That's where we see inflation costs going up. Look, Montana's a very rural state. Yep. Everything is either freight into or out of Montana. And energy has a huge impact on our way of life, not to mention all of the households across this country. And Jesse, you know as well as I do that the people that get hit the hardest by higher energy costs are the ones at the lowest end of the income scale, trying to keep their homes heated and trying to get to work this week.
Absolutely. It's always the lowest common denominator that's hit the hardest by these top-down policies. And kind of along those lines, I know that energy is a huge job producer here in Montana. Can you talk a little bit about the Keystone XL pipeline and some of the jobs around that were cost, and Senator Tester's position on that? Yeah,
and seeing that this is one of those places where we have a politician. There's no other way to put it. Someone who went out and says one thing and actually does something else. So when the Keystone XL pipeline was first proposed back in 2012, I actually testified at a public hearing as a freshman legislator in the Montana legislature. And it took 10 years to get the permitting in place. Finally, Donald Trump went ahead and made an executive order and got the pipeline permitted, and they started construction. It was going to provide 850,000 barrels a day of crude oil to the refineries along the Gulf. About 150,000 barrels a day of that crude was going to come from North Dakota and Montana. There was going to be an on-ramp in Baker, Montana. It was going to provide to Montana specific approximately $60 million a year of tax revenue through some of the poorest counties in the state on the eastern side of the state, just from tax revenue from that pipeline being there. And when Joe Biden came into office, there was a lot of people that were saying, please don't pull that permit. There was billions of dollars of investment that had already taken place, okay, with pumping stations and pipe that was put in the ground. And John Tester sat silent. He sat silent. And Joe Biden rescinded the permit. And on his second day of office, they had to start dismantling that entire facility. And it cost this state and this nation a lot of money. And then after the fact, John comes out and says, yeah, that probably wasn't a good idea. What the people across the state of Montana and what people across the United States want are people that are just going to be honest and upright and forthright about what they believe and what they stand for. And don't try to play politics and say that you're for something, but don't give us the actions to back it up. So what I would recommend to people as they consider their elections, as they go into the voting booth going forward, is look at people's actions. Don't listen to the words.
I think that's a very, very good piece of advice. I mean, I was over on the eastern side of the state, I don't know, 6-7 months ago, and I saw what looked like a boneyard of pieces of pipe from the Keystone XL pipeline just sitting there that were brand new, never used, just kind of sitting there. What an incredible amount of waste.
I saw a $500 million pumping station that was constructed in Baker, Montana, that was ready for the pipes to be hooked up on either side of it, that was scrapped. That was scrapped because this project was taken off a line.
That is just unbelievable. And the number of jobs, I mean, $60 million a year in just tax revenue alone to Montana, that is an astronomical number. And we're still getting the oil.
We're talking about going through counties that have populations of 1,500 to 4,000 people. That would pay, that kind of revenue would pay for their schools. It would pay for their roads. It would pay for medical facilities in those communities. It would be an incredible windfall. And guess what? It would create all the jobs and put us in a much, much stronger place from a national security standpoint, knowing that we had those crude oil reserves coming into our country that were either domestic or at least from a good friend in Canada.
Wow, it's just unbelievable. All the complexities that people don't understand that go into this process, and the regulations that get put up and are barriers in between people just helping one another. Producers bringing more oil to refineries, refineries bringing more oil and gasoline to consumers. It's scary how far this has gone. So with HR1, what are some other of the key points that HR1 would do or would have done
Well, the pipeline, the redefining of some of the aspects of NEPA, and just making sure that they declared some of the outdated rules that they were putting in place for the interpretations, to make sure that you could, and put some time frames in there with which they had to start issuing permits and review times, so that we can get the pipelines approved a lot faster. You can produce all of the energy products that you want, but if you can't put that in pipelines and get them distributed to the places that are going to consume them or refine them, then you're still going to have problems. Again, another really big component of that was to start permitting the export facilities for that natural gas. We've got our allies over in Europe right now, and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that Joe Biden pulled the restrictions off of when he went into office to allow Russia to start generating revenue from natural gas, but he wouldn't let the folks in Pennsylvania or in the Bakken oil fields to make sure that we could keep our production up. So this would be to permit those export facilities so that we could start selling energy to our allies over in Eastern Europe, so that they would not be dependent upon Russia. I mean, that's, I would think most people would say that's a pretty good idea. And then the critical minerals. China right now controls 60% of the critical minerals around the world. And even if you believe for a moment that we can survive with just renewable energy, with solar and wind resources, which I do not believe that it provides the baseload electricity that we need for this country. But even if you did believe that, you still need the critical minerals that are necessary in order to build those facilities. I mean, one wind turbine requires about 4 tons, just about 4 tons of copper. One. I've gone to the wind farm in Judith Gap, okay, and the turbines that are there, which were built, I don't know, 15 years ago, but they're like 120 feet, each one of those blades. As they pass. The ones the newer ones that are north of Miles City, those turbines, each blade is about 220 feet long. They're twice as large. And of course, the generator now, instead of being about 1.5 megawatts each when they're full capacity, these things are turning about 2.7, almost 3 megawatts. So they're producing twice as much electricity, but that requires a lot of copper. And you just can't pull that out of the air. And as one of my colleagues in committee once said, I said, where are you going to get all this copper if we're not mining it? And they said, well, when we tear down all the buildings because they're not energy efficient, we're going to recycle all the copper that's in those buildings and we'll use that. And I said, what, are you going to tear down Los Angeles? Because 4 tons per turbine, that's a lot of copper.
It's an incredible amount of copper. And I think that you bring up a really good point that wind and solar, these types of energy, they're not coming from the bottom up. They're being forced from a top down way. And if the technology was there, and if they provided the cheapest, most reliable source of energy, everybody would already be using them. But you've got tax credits, you've got all these different spending bills that have come out. One of those being the bipartisan infrastructure bill.
Why would you call that bipartisan?
Can you talk a little bit about the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the kind of the spending boondoggle that it became? And this was engineered by Senator Tester, if I'm not incorrect.
Absolutely. Look, the infrastructure bill was nothing more than a giveaway to companies that otherwise wouldn't be able to make a profit. They're estimating now that that's going to contribute $1.2 trillion to renewable energy companies that we all know are very close ties to the Democrat Party. And John Tester absolutely embraced that legislation wholeheartedly, because contributors of his are going to be making an awful lot of money off of it. It's an absolute shame.
What percentage of that quote unquote bipartisan infrastructure bill actually went to infrastructure, like the roads, bridges, highways?
Look, when it went through, that's a couple of years ago now. I could have told you exactly the percentage, okay? But I think that we were somewhere down around 30% of what the actual total package was going to go to roads, bridges, water systems, and sewer systems. I do believe that we should be investing in roads, bridges, water systems, and sewer systems. That is the role of government. But there's a lot of other things that are not. The wind farm, again, I go back to the one north of Miles City. There's a couple of reasons that wind farm is feasible right now. And that is, number one, they closed down the generators 1 and 2 at Colstrip. That makes it possible because now you have a huge transmission line that goes from Colstrip, Montana to the West Coast up in Washington State, okay, that has all of that energy that's missing. It's about 1,000 or 1,100 megawatts, okay, that is gone. So with that energy being gone, you have the ability you have capacity. Then the other thing is it blows hard up there in Rosebud County. So you have to have an energy source. And then the third thing is they receive $30 million in subsidies from the federal government, from us taxpayers. I went to an energy conference down in Houston about 3 months ago, and it was a global energy conference. And there were people there from Europe and from all over our country, and they were all talking about these renewable energy sources. But every one of them were talking about how much that they were investing in them. And if you are subsidizing them to that extent, sometime or another, you're going to run out of other people's money. You have to have, this thing has to make financial sense. And what we do know is that we have the ability to make financial sense out of a coal-fired power plant. We can make financial sense out of a natural gas-fired power plant. And we know that they will run 24/7, whether the sun is shining, whether the wind is blowing, whether the snow is falling, they will run 24/7. And if we don't watch out what we're doing to our baseload electricity, it could be very tragic for our country and for our national security.
Absolutely. And another point to touch on is that even with all those subsidies, Northwestern Energy is still seeking a 28% rate hike for Montana power payers because it's still not economically feasible with wind and solar.
This is what is the problem with mandates. When you have mandates and you are mandating to these power companies that a certain portion of their portfolio has to contain renewable energy, it ends up falling back down on the consumer. The other thing that not too many people have been talking about for the last 6 or 8 months, but just recently I've heard some more conversations about it, are the mandates that they're placing on the power companies for upgrading of all their transformers. And they're trying to take these transformers and upgrade the efficiencies from about 98% to 99 or 99.5%. And they don't have the transformers available to them. And the cost is astronomically greater. And they are mandated. So when you have the power company being forced to place all of this additional infrastructure in, that doesn't increase the efficiencies, so it doesn't pencil out, that's where you end up having the additional cost to the ratepayer. I talk to co-ops because in such a rural state, we have a lot of co-ops,
Yep.
Okay, the smaller power companies. And they right now, and I've talked to many of them, they are in no way able to either provide all these transformers or to accommodate a bunch of electric cars if, in fact, we did have a great demand here in Montana over the next 10 years. They do not have the capacity. They do not have the infrastructure in place to even accommodate that. So if it was mandated that they were to start providing all of that additional infrastructure, the rates will go up.
Absolutely. And because of all these issues we've been talking about today, it seems like the American dream has been pushed out of reach for many Americans under the first 2 years of the Biden administration. What needs to happen, I guess, to reignite the American dream for these Americans?
Look, the recipe is very easy. It's not complex. Americans for Prosperity have been pushing free market principles for many, many years now. I've been associated with the group for quite some time, trying to make sure that we push those free market principles and we can restore them again. It is a question of electing the right officials to make sure that we push back on big government. It truly is That's simple. My favorite bill title is repeal. And when we can start reducing the size and the scope of the federal government, allowing the states to function the way that they are supposed to, what we will see is prosperity in reach of everyone again. We continue to see good legislation in the House of Representatives get passed up to the Senate, and the Senate, the Republicans are in the minority right now. And while we hear a lot of boasting taking place about what's good for the state of Montana or what's good for America, what we don't see is John Tester voting in the best interest of the people across Montana right now. And he tries to walk around the state and proclaim and profess that he is just a good old moderate and looking out for our interests, but we don't have the Keystone XL pipeline. We certainly still have the student loan redistribution program that's going to end up costing somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 billion or more to taxpayers across the country. We see issue after issue where he takes a backseat and hides out as long as he can. So we have to make sure that we're putting people in office that actually perform. Okay. Watch how they work. Don't listen to what they say.
Absolutely. And I know that you've got a very busy convention coming up, but just to leave the viewers with this, I mean, I'm going to see you in a couple weeks. I've got an office appointment scheduled with you to come and talk to you as part of our DC fly-in, where we fly in and we talk to our federal delegation. Why do you think these types of fly-ins are very important for representatives to hear?
Well, it's good for a lot of the members of Congress because they don't have the intimate relationships that I am fortunate to have with my constituents and with my local organizations. I pride myself in making sure that if I'm not in Washington, that I'm actually on the ground in Montana talking to people, to organizations that are going to be impacted the most. But for those representatives that don't have those types of relationships, it's really, really good for groups like AFP to go in and meet with those representatives to make sure that they understand not just their priorities, but why these things are important for the restoration of our country.
Wonderful. Well, is there anything else you want to add to the audience of Montanans?
It's an honor. It's a privilege to represent Montana, but it's an incredible responsibility too. I'm one of two representatives now, and I take that responsibility very seriously. And I try to do the work that I promised everyone that I would, and think about each and every one of them as I cast many of those votes.
Well, we certainly appreciate your work in Congress and really appreciate you making time, and looking forward to seeing you in a couple weeks in D.C. Thank you,
so
Congressman.
much, Jesse.
Appreciate it.